This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of When Science Speaks. This episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting, a unique consulting firm in Washington, D.C. that helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build key relationships with the stakeholders who matter most, whether that's investors, policymakers, or the public. We are so fortunate to have Marc Appel here with us today on today's episode. Marc is CEO of Orange Grove Bio, a preclinical drug development platform focused on driving down the cost of drug discovery and advancing therapies into clinical trials. OGB partners with leading universities, particularly outside of the biotech hubs of Boston and San Francisco, to license transformational medicines that streamline the drug development process to get them into clinical trials faster. The company also sources programs through investment in preclinical stage biotech companies, where OGB can play an important operational role. Its mission is to work to bring forward more therapies to treat patients and cure disease. In addition to his role as CEO, Marc serves as an entrepreneur in residence at Yale University, where he works with the Office of Cooperative Research to support PIs on the development of new biotech and medical device technologies into companies. And Marc was just appointed to the External Advisory Review Board at the Center for Biotechnology at Stony Brook University. Prior to founding OGB, Marc helped to lead the healthcare investing effort at Marathon Asset Management, a global asset manager with over $18 billion in AUM, where he made public market investments across the capital structure, in addition to co-founding and growing the firm's royalty and structured healthcare lending business. He's been an investment professional at several other esteemed firms, in addition to serving as a consultant at McKinsey & Company. Marc earned his MBA at Harvard Business School, his JD at Harvard Law School, and his bachelor's in history and classical civilization, summa cum laude, at Yale University. It's great to have you on the show, Marc. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, excited to be here with you too, Marc.
So I'd like to start off by asking you about OGB and your work there and more detail on the company's mission.
Sure. So OGB, as you kind of alluded to in the introduction, was founded to really develop more technologies coming out of universities that are not in Boston, not in San Francisco, a lot of the places that have a lot of great research, but are being overlooked today by a lot of the drug developers and venture capital firms. Mm-hmm. And the way we do that is to bring to bear not just capital, but also a really experienced group of drug developers and management teams. And we bring those people in to really either develop the technologies from scratch that we're licensing from the universities, or to work alongside the kind of early stage management team, which is very often an academic, a postdoc, et cetera, that may not have the drug development experience needed to get a drug through the optimization process, through IND enabling studies, and certainly not through early clinical development, which is also something that we do. In terms of our areas of focus, we've been mostly focused on the oncology and immune disease-related spaces. That being said, we have ventured out from there on certain occasions. Right now, for example, we're moving very rapidly forward with a COVID program that has some immune-related elements to it, in that it's focused on acute respiratory distress syndrome in COVID patients, which we think is a huge unmet need and actually relates a bit to the immune system. That being said, never anticipated several months ago that the program that we'd be most focused on and most excited about right now would be in the call it almost the infectious disease related space. But we're excited to be doing our part in helping the world get over this current pandemic.
Right, absolutely, very, very exciting and important work. I want to ask you about something you've written about recently, and that's the Remdesivir data. For listeners who aren't familiar with it, Remdesivir is an experimental medicine. Actually, it was recently approved by the FDA under its emergency use authorization. And it's shown some limited positive early kind of success in helping to accelerate recovery from COVID-19 infection. And so I'm interested, given your expertise in this area, Marc, what your view is on this medicine at this point.
First off, just to talk a little about what remdesivir is, it's actually a drug that inhibits the COVID-19 coronavirus from going through RNA synthesis. So what happens when the virus enters your body is the outer packaging of the virus kind of falls away. The RNA gets picked up inside your cell and normally just starts to go through a replicative process, which allows for more and more viral RNA to be replicated and built up in the cell, which then makes that cell not able to function. What happens with remdesivir is it actually replaces one of the base pairs in that RNA synthesis and causes an improper kind of RNA synthesis process to occur. The challenge with remdesivir is it isn't a magical cure. I think it's a helpful drug, but it's not a total solution. There are ways in which the virus can get around remdesivir. Just looking at some of the studies that were done, there was a study, just to walk you through them, there was a study done in China. It wasn't able to fully enroll. It only got 237 out of the targeted 453 patients. Wasn't able to show a statistically significant improvement, but it did show, which I think was really promising, that patients that were treated really early with this drug did have a faster time to clinical improvement than those on placebo. And so that was at least a promising sign. Then there was a much larger study done through the NIAID. And there, it really did show that remdesivir, patients who were administered remdesivir recovered 31% faster than those on placebo, and mortality ended up being a couple of percent lower. So they said not a magical cure, but certainly a helpful drug. Mm-hmm. Right now, where we are is this drug has been made available under the FDA's emergency use authorization provision. It's really only limited to those who have very severe COVID-19 disease. And that's because, number one, it isn't going to cure all patients. It's going to hopefully help in some of the more severe cases. And it comes with a lot of very strong side effects, right? Mm-hmm. Nausea and vomiting are two of them, as well as potentially, liver toxicities. And we really don't understand the full extent of those toxicities at this point. So, it's not something you want to be using. You couldn't even use it at home because it's not administered that way, but you wouldn't want to be using this on every patient. You really want to keep this to those where there's a very high risk of mortality.
Mm-hmm. Really helpful. Thanks for walking us through that, Marc. I want to go back in time, as it were. I mentioned in the intro that you earned your bachelor's in history and also ancient civilizations. And so I'm curious, I often like to look back to lessons of the past or things that had occurred, major events, and how they were handled to get some insight into how things, may unfold in the future. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, with your training, what lessons or insights from the ancients do you feel maybe are still relevant and useful guides for us in our modern world?
There's a whole bunch of different directions I could take this, but let me hit upon, I think, a couple of the biggest learnings from the ancient world that are really poignant today. The first is that severe epidemics tend to have a really lasting impact on societies and in many, many different ways that are really hard to imagine at the time. Let me give you an example. So in the 430s to 420s BC, a very major plague hit Athens and caused people to lose confidence in their government and the rule of law. And this plague recurred over and over again. It killed the leader of their country, Pericles, and it had a really lasting impact on the Athenian Empire and in its war with Sparta. And it caused Athenian citizens to become a lot more hostile to foreigners who were seeking citizenship, and caused them as a country to become much more insular. And I think there's probably a lot of learnings in how the Athenians responded, and ultimately then in their defeat to Sparta that occurred a number of years later, partially potentially induced by this plague, that we can learn about our society today, and if we become too insular, what the negative effects of that could be. Maybe a learning, particularly for investors and entrepreneurs here, is another plague that really hit in the ancient world was during the era of Marcus Aurelius in Rome. It really took the Roman Empire from sort of its pinnacle to a much lower state where it started its gradual decline into its eventual destruction. And that destabilization of nations that these kind of pandemics can do, or tend to be very, during that period, you also saw coinage debased. You saw people losing their jobs, and you can see a lot of parallels with the kind of devastation to the entrepreneurial and investor community that's really occurred during this crisis. And hopefully we can learn from some of those mistakes and try to bounce back much more rapidly instead of sort of hunkering down, which really could cause a lot of long-term issues with our economy. Let me get a couple of other things that I think are really important that we can learn from the ancient world. Another is really the importance of careful observation. I think this is going to be really relevant as we think about how do we get a cure for COVID-19 and then ultimately to the vaccines. Many of the great Greek philosophers really believe strongly in careful observation, right? For example, Eratosthenes, without going anywhere, without really leaving his village, was able to use the shadows from the sun to measure the circumference of the world millennia before Magellan's voyage around the world. Mm-hmm. So really using the power of observation there. Similarly, Aristotle, wrote a lot of detailed biology texts really by observing the nature around him in a lot of detail. And really one of the first significant physicians in the world, Galen, we can still understand a lot of diseases he was grappling with today because he took such detailed notes of everything that he observed around him. And for us to be able to really conquer this COVID epidemic, we really have to be very data-driven, very attentive to the detail, make sure we're using placebo controls as much as possible so that we can really get to something that is a knowable cure rather than sort of jumping on each new hypothesis as it comes up and thinking that that's going to be our solution, because unfortunately most of the things out there are not going to work, and we just have to be very focused on getting to something that will work. And one last thing that I aspect of the ancient world that I'll bring up here is the application of basic research to into actual useful products for humanity. And this is something that goes back to ancient times. And really the father of all of this, of kind of practical application of science, is Archimedes, right? He's the one who said, give me a place to stand and a large enough lever and I'll move the world. He's also the one who also used supposedly these large heat rays, lots of different mirrors and lenses shining in the right way to light enemy ships on fire when they were attacking Syracuse. So I like to think of Orange Grove as a modern day Archimedes, taking the basic research from our great universities and figuring out how to develop those into applicable drug programs that can really help humanity.
That's fascinating. I really appreciate that, Marc. As a 3-year Latin student, at least in high school for me, always fascinated by these kind of lessons and what we can learn. And those are really important insights that you provided. And thank you for sharing. It's really not out there very much. People really aren't talking about these examples. I appreciate you sharing your training and your expertise there. And I want to go from there to ask you about how you decided to focus your professional life on funding innovations in healthcare and what led you to concentrate in the field.
Sure. So anyone who tells you that their career has been a very straight line path and they knew from the get-go what they were going to be doing, either they are lying to you or they've had a really, really boring career. So I certainly didn't expect to end up where I am when I was growing up. I've always been interested in science. I come from a family of doctors, so I knew I always wanted to have something of the scientific world embedded in my career. I took a lot of the science courses in college and was really excited about that. Although I majored in sort of the liberal arts, I tried to get a pretty well-rounded curriculum and thought long and hard actually about going to medical school. But when an opportunity came up to join McKinsey, I thought, let me go get this basic business knowledge first and really get a grounding in what's out there. And McKinsey and the consulting firms really tout themselves as giving you a little bit of exposure to a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. I thought I was going to spend most of my time working on pharma situations, but soon after I got there, the financial crisis broke out, the 2008 financial crisis, and I spent most of my time working on financial services problems and really trying to help the financial system recover from a really unprecedented shock. Realized from there that there's a lot I needed to learn about the world, and that finance was actually pretty interesting to me. How companies get funded, and how do you get from point A to point B, and what's the money required, was actually an important part of how a lot of things get done, across a lot of different industries. So I went back and got my law degree and my MBA. Thought those would be helpful in kind of getting a better perspective on the world, but still knew I wanted to have a career that had a lot of science in it. And so I ended up joining an investment firm, really to bring those finance skills to bear out of graduate school, and really found I had a knack for healthcare related investments. It's a really complicated field where a lot of detailed knowledge of both, I'd say two things. It's science and it's regulatory, right? Those are so that law degree keeps coming in handy, are needed if you're going to be successful in that space. And so spent a bunch of years investing across lots of different types of healthcare assets. I was an investor in hospitals, in insurance companies, in pharmacy benefit management companies, in medical devices, in biotech, and pharma. And then during that time, saw there was really an unmet need in the royalty space. And so Marathon decided it was going to get meaningfully into the drug royalty space, as well as into lending money to biotech companies. And I really jumped into that initiative and spent a few years helping to build up that business. It was during that time that Yale had approached me. They had gotten a lot of money from Len Blavatnik to invest in spinning out early stage biotech startups from the university. And they asked me to get involved to help them think about what programs to spin out and what kind of funding to give those programs, how to guide these different PIs, what kind of stories they should be telling, what kind of pitch decks they should be building to really get these messages from the university out there and translate the science. And I realized that there was just a very big, a lot of potential there, and decided that this is what I wanted to make my career out of. And the opportunity came to leave and team up with my current business partner to build Orange Grove, and the rest is history. And we've had a really good time working with a lot of great institutions and academics, and really funding and building amazing biotech companies.
For sure. And I want to ask you about one element that you just mentioned, Marc, which is the ability to communicate, founders and executives, their ability to craft compelling, accessible narratives. And you have this deep expertise analyzing and putting together deals, particularly in the life sciences space. And I'd like to have you talk to us a bit about the role, the ability for founders and executives to put together, to develop these compelling narratives about the value of their products. How does that sort of play in their ultimate success as a business?
What I would say, first off, fundraising and being able to pitch a deal, it's a real skill, right? It's not as glamorous as coming up with an amazing scientific discovery, but it's almost as important if you're going to be the founder of a company or you're going to be an executive in biotech. And it really takes a lot of work and a lot of years to get good at it, right? To taking that message, honing it really well, and making sure others can understand it. And really, the people that end up being best at it are those that understand that, deep knowledge of science is great, but can I take that deep knowledge of science and can I distill that down into something that, anybody on the street would be able to understand at a high level, so they can really, engage with that science and say, okay, this is something I'd really want to be involved in some way, even if I don't have the deep expertise of the academics involved. And I find that the academics that tend to be the hardest to work with are those that, think that the hard stuff's already been solved, right? They know the science, so everything else is super easy, and they must be super good at it just because they have a deep scientific expertise. And I'll tell you that just because you're a great scientist does not make you a great communicator. It's really two very, very distinct skills, and we all start out as beginners, and anybody can get good at it. It just requires a lot of practice.
Right, right, absolutely. And I really enjoy my work with scientists and engineers who, again, who have this deep knowledge, innovation, genius to put these things together, but then communicating it is a different aspect altogether. Absolutely. And I'd love for you to talk about any example where maybe there was a difficult situation you were involved in as far as different elements of the business maybe just not coming together the way that you felt they should, and how you went in there and dealt with that.
Yeah, I can give you a great example. It was one that I was working on through Yale. It was through their Blavatnik fund. And when I first heard the story, I was the only one who really got the message. Right, there was some amazing data buried in there. The academic was a really smart guy, a really nice guy too, and really open to good feedback. But no one had given him the feedback. Here's what you have to do to make this a great presentation and a great company and a great story that everyone's going to buy into. And so, most people heard it and sort of dismissed it and said, this is nothing that exciting. I can't really get my head around what's going on. And then what happened was, he and I sat down. I gave him a lot of feedback about what he could do to improve the presentation. Worked with him on it for several months. Really, we really dove into the details and figured out, he actually had a lot of other great data that he wasn't even showing, that he should have been showing. Mm-hmm. And we put the stuff into a format that any layman could understand. And by the time we were done, we had something that was really compelling. We were able to start a company around it, able to raise funding around it, able to put a management team around it, and you got to see his great science actually translated into great drug discovery programs that hopefully will come to market.
And none of that would have happened, as you pointed out, without that month-long effort to really translate and distill.
Exactly. It really requires a couple of elements for this success to happen. It requires a scientist who's really open to collaboration and open to feedback. It requires some good guidance, in this case from someone like me, but there's lots of people who are probably much better at this than I am, but somebody who kind of comes from that business experience and knows how to communicate these things effectively. And it just requires kind of time and effort to really hone the story and get it perfect. And it wasn't just really my feedback that got it where it needed to go. We went ahead and brought it to people at the Office of Cooperative Research who were super enthusiastic, super helpful, really were very collaborative and allowed the message to really get refined, and to a lot of the other advisors that also worked with me at Yale that provided a lot of really good feedback. So it was really a team effort, but we got where we wanted to be.
That's great. That's a great story, Mark. And you started by talking about this unexpected focus. Who would have thought that COVID-19, and the products around it, the race to find cures, treatments, therapies would be kind of high up on the agenda at the beginning of the year, for example. And so with global teams now racing to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, how do you see the dealer investment community responding?
Sure. So I think you have to break down the COVID, most people have a lot of folks have shifted effort to saying, okay, what am I investing in the COVID landscape? So maybe it's worth starting there. First off, the COVID landscape is several different pieces, right? It's vaccines, and its treatments, which can fall into different buckets, right? There's antivirals, and there are kind of anti-inflammatory or symptom-related treatments. In terms of vaccines, it's really an interesting conundrum. The space is really dominated by larger-sized companies because of the cost of manufacturing, and you don't really see too many biotech investors spending a lot of time investing around that theme. Within the public markets, there's some exception to that because people are buying into some of the larger pharma companies or biotechs like Moderna, based around some of what's happening there. But it's not really a place as earlier stage companies, it's that easy to play and with smaller dollar amounts. I mean, Moderna has gotten several $100 million from the government to enhance their manufacturing capability. So it's on a very different scale than earlier stage research where we tend to play. You are seeing a lot of investors, earlier stage ones like ourselves, pursuing COVID symptom-related treatments. And really, acute respiratory distress syndrome has become a really popular problem to solve because there's both profit potential and a chance to do some real good. And the profit potential is really in the stuff other than COVID. So in treating other ARDS populations, of which there's about 200,000 patients just in the US every year, and not really, and through the COVID angle, it's really just a way to help society in the shorter term and ideally at least from our viewpoint, not a way to make profit. We're really hoping to give the COVID drug for COVID purposes away as minimally above cost as possible, so that it can really get to the most number of patients possible.
Marc, I saw the recent press release about the launch of your portfolio company, Asalyxa Bio. Tell me what you and Orange Grove have planned there.
Asalyxa Bio is an Orange Grove portfolio company focused on the targeted delivery of drug to neutrophils using microparticles. Neutrophils are one of our immune system's first-line defenders. When they notice a problem in the body, they rush to the site of injury, and if too many of them get there, they become harmful rather than helpful and can release chemical signals and cause tissue damage in what is known as a cytokine storm. Asalyx's lead program is ASX-100, a microparticle made partially of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. These microparticles look like bacteria to neutrophils and are selectively eaten by them. Particles then break down inside of the immune cells and cause those immune cells to go to the liver and quietly release drug rather than targeting tissue and causing harmful inflammation. In mouse models for acute respiratory distress, these particles have meant the difference between life and death in the animals. We're rapidly advancing this program into clinical trials with the objective of treating people with acute respiratory distress, including COVID-19, as well as a wide range of other neutrophil-mediated diseases. We're also exploring multiple ways of expanding the platform delivery technology into new therapeutic areas by combining ASX-100 with other compounds.
In both of those areas, and we're going to continue to be spending a lot of our time on those areas going forward. And I think that, you know, the investor and entrepreneurial communities, once we're over this, are going to really dive back deep into trying to find the cure for cancer, the cure for rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera. So.
Really, really interesting. Well, my last question, Marc, relates, you know, as a successful entrepreneur, you know, a healthcare investor, you know, what's the most important thing entrepreneurs should be doing right now? I mean, you've alluded to that in your previous answer. Anything to add? Sort of, what's the most important thing that entrepreneurs should be thinking about just to position themselves for success despite this turbulence? I mean, you pointed out some of the areas where you think are promising. Are there other things that you feel kind of in preparation for a post-COVID world that entrepreneurs should be thinking about as well?
Yeah, I'll give a couple of warnings, because I think the world is shifting, and as much as, you know, COVID itself may eventually get cured, the world is going to change irreversibly. First off, if you're starting a new biotech company today, be really careful about international supply chains, because you can see how easily those can break in a pandemic-driven, trade war-driven world. And we're going to start seeing, I think, a lot more domestic drug development and just domestic manufacturing going forward. And it's something that we should think more carefully about than I think people have in the past. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing things overseas where it makes sense, but there's going to be a lot more of a need to have those things domestic. And frankly, I think there's going to be a lot more of a political push to have those things domestic too, because we've seen how much of a problem it can be when critical R&D and critical drug manufacturing isn't available, and countries become very nationalistic, and suddenly if you don't have it at home, you're in a very tough spot. Secondly, is I think we're going to have to be, as investors, as entrepreneurs thinking about investors, more thoughtful about fundraising, right? First off, always raise more money than you actually need, because there's always things you can't predict. Nobody could have predicted this COVID crisis 6 months ago, but it's had a huge impact, and those who were not prepared are finding that they're very short on cash. And you should also be really thoughtful around who you take money from. There's a lot of CFIUS issues and things of that sort that are popping up. There's certainly concerns around majority foreign investors and what that could mean for U.S. innovation. And I just think that these political ramifications are going to be really critical. So if you're an entrepreneur, you should get the right advice early from your legal advisors as to what you should and shouldn't do on this front, because you could take some money early that could cost you your whole business in the longer run. And finally, let me end on a more of an upbeat note on this question. You need to remain determined. You should expect to get 100 no's before anyone says yes. It's true more today than ever before, right? As the amount of kind of available capital flowing into early stage innovation is potentially in a temporary dip with the COVID crisis. But doesn't mean we're not going to come through this, and doesn't mean if you aren't determined that you're not going to eventually succeed. And I can tell you, even with Orange Grove, that it took us a while to get going because there were a lot of people that didn't think we'd be able to make it. And it's the same thing with any entrepreneur. You have to be very determined, keep pushing forward, and you'll eventually succeed.
Well, Marc Appel, thank you very much for taking us from Marcus Aurelius in the ancient world right through current day and into the horizon. It was really a fascinating conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us, particularly during this extremely busy time for the company that you're leading.
Mark, really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to join you, and looking forward to continuing the conversation at some future date.
That sounds great. Sounds great. And thank you, listeners, for being here for this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you will be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.